Good afternoon. I'm Benedetta Berti. I'm the head of policy planning in the office of the Secretary General at NATO. And we're going to continue and build on the conversation that we just ended with the previous panel in terms of looking at the different interlinkages between security, climate change, and stability and peace. But we're going to bring an extra dimension that hasn't been mentioned so far, and that is, of course, also the role of the armed forces, the role of the defense industry. How do we fit in? Or don't, and what are we doing, and how are we thinking about the impact of climate change on security, and how we are responding in terms of adaptation and contribution to mitigation. So the topic of the panel is very cleverly, if I can read, tanks, troops, and temperature rise, implementing NATO's climate security strategy, which I think is a smart way to look into, to go into the discussion. So we're going to look at different, first of all, how NATO is thinking about climate change and climate and security, but then also broaden the aperture and talk a little bit more about also national perspectives in terms of armed forces adaptation and mitigation, and also in terms of how different stakeholders see the impact of climate change on defense and security, but also on defense specifically, which we haven't done so far as much during the day. I will speak very little because that's the perks of just being the moderator, but I would just start the discussion by framing it in terms of why NATO and climate change, because it's not trivial. This is something that the organization has been really invested in recent years. I think throughout 7 decades, you've always seen investment into increasing energy efficiency, into new technologies, into designing environmental protection standards. So there's, of course, a legacy in terms of what NATO has done in the past. But the focus on climate change, as climate change is relatively recent. In 2021, we adopted both a strategy, a climate change and security agenda, and an action plan that took us into how to make that strategy a reality. It focuses on 4 main areas. It is about situational awareness, it is about adaptation, it is about contributing to mitigation, and it is about increasing partnerships. And we'll have my colleague from NATO here, Richard, will tell us a little bit more concretely how is this working out since the agenda was agreed in 2021. I would also say that in terms of how we're looking at the role of climate change in shaping the security environment, that has gone from being a relatively marginal topic to a very prominent one. And I'll give you an example. Just a couple of months ago, we adopted our strategic concept. This is the strategy of the alliance. It's an exercise done roughly every decade. And if you read the prior one from 2010, there is a very short reference to environmental factors, but it's really not part of the analysis. Fast forward to 2022, it couldn't be clearer. Climate change is defined as one of the defining challenges of our time. It is defined as a crisis and threat multiplier. It is defined as a central factor that will affect our security in the Euro-Atlantic area, in our neighborhood, that is profoundly affecting the way our armed forces operate, and that requires in-depth thinking and adaptation. So there is I would say, a step change into thinking about the importance of climate security. And in terms of the core task of NATO, which is a military political alliance, I think it's very interesting that we were able to agree that integrating climate perspectives has to be a strategic enabler. In other words, has to be something we build into everything we do, from conventional defense to countering terrorism, from working with partners to human security. So I think in terms of the conceptual, we have moved miles forward very quickly, but of course now the main challenge, and that will be the topic that we will discuss over the next 50 minutes or so, is what are we doing to translate this much higher level of political ambition into implementation and into concrete goals and concrete deliverables. And to talk us through this and some of the challenges, we have a great lineup of panelists. I will introduce them one by one as I give them the floor. We'll start with NATO, and then we'll go broader. So here we have Richard Brewin, who is very much involved and leading on the climate and energy security work. And so, Richard, I laid out a little bit about some of the main priorities of our strategy. It would be really great if you could take us into the nitty-gritty and what does this mean, what have we achieved, and also looking at the future, what are some of the opportunities and the challenges that you see for this agenda. And just housekeeping, roughly 7-8 minutes for all speakers, so we have a little bit of time for Q&A. Richard, floor is yours.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Benedetta. Good afternoon, everybody, and it's a pleasure to be invited to come here today to discuss, as you said, Benedetta, one of the defining challenges of our time. I think it's fair to say right up at the front of this conversation that it takes place in the backdrop of a war that is raging in Europe. And this is something that we thought that we would never see again, and unfortunately we are. So again, right up front, I think it's fair to say that anything that the Alliance does in this space, military effectiveness, operational capability, remains the baseline requirement. We start from there and then we move forward with the rest of the discussion. But of course, that doesn't mean to say that we don't recognise it as a threat multiplier, because we do. Alongside a number of the allies within their own security strategies, and alongside a number of other international organisations who have also come to that same conclusion. For the Alliance, the reason why is it affects absolutely everything that the military does. It is going to and does affect where we are likely to operate, under what conditions, the types of missions that we are likely to be getting involved in now and in the future, and therefore the types of capabilities that we are likely to be looking towards. But coming first on to the why, before we get into the how and all of the rest of the discussion. There's a lot of evidence if we start to unpick some examples, and this is the why NATO is interested. There is a lot of evidence, for example, when we start looking at the second and third order consequences, because we've discussed today, and the discussion is ongoing, about the primary consequences of climate change, but when we really start to look at the security considerations, the disproportionate impact that it has on women and girls in certain parts of the world under certain conditions. That's a fact. What does that mean for the Alliance? What is the added value that we can bring to this discussion? And these are some of the questions that we're starting to ask ourselves. Is this, for example, about pre-deployment training, so that troops, when they're going into a particular region, understand that this could be part of the security dynamic? Is it that, or is it something else? And we need to keep on diving into these sorts of discussions. Then we look at things like loss of land and livelihood, and what that might do. We've already heard in some of the other presentations today about those sorts of consequences. Will people migrate? Will they be forced to migrate? Or will they actually be trapped? And under both of those scenarios, will they be able to find a legitimate source of income that is alternative to their current source of income? And if they can't, does it mean that they are more likely to be attracted to serious organised crime, or indeed paid terrorism? Why is this important to the Alliance? Well, because it could affect both within the Alliance's borders, or it could affect our broader neighbourhood. And anything that affects, obviously, the security of the nearly 1 billion citizens for which the Alliance is responsible for needs to play into our narrative, needs to play into our understanding in terms of our future outlook and our foresight. And it's for those sorts of reasons that within the new strategic concept, and indeed in the summit declarations, NATO heads of state and government have agreed that NATO should seek to become the leading international organisation when it comes to understanding and adapting to the impact of climate change on security. Now, obviously, those are very grandiose words, and we really need to put some meat on the bones as to what exactly does that mean. And in order to translate that into action, that is why we have the Climate Change and Security Action Plan. Benedetta has already highlighted that that's centered around 4 key pillars: awareness, adaptation, mitigation, and outreach. And if we start off with the awareness pillar, this is around 3 main elements: NATO's strategic environment, NATO's assets, installations, missions and operations, and civil preparedness and resilience. And we've gone through some analysis in terms of trying to understand, and we certainly couldn't do it in the first iteration. This is going to be a medium to long-term game that we're having to play to really start to unpick this. And the reason that's important, and I won't steal too much of the Colonel's thunder, because I know that you're going to talk about the military implications, but if I could just give a couple of examples from my experience, predominantly from the UK, because that's where I've spent the majority of my career. Now, when the Alliance first was deployed to Afghanistan, the British version of the Chinook helicopter didn't cope too well with the hot and high, dusty, arid environment. And the reason being is a simple law of physics. For every 1 degree centigrade that the ambient temperature goes up, it has a detrimental impact on available helicopter torque at any one moment. To the point where a request went into the equipment manufacturer to upgrade the engines. Now, that is a direct adaptation to the operating environment, and I think we are only going to see more and more of this sort of thing happening. But at the same time, we can also look at mitigation, because when those engines were upgraded, they were made more fuel efficient. And why would they not be? So we've adapted to the climate, we've done what we could to mitigate, and at the same time, we've enhanced operational effectiveness. And these are increasingly the sorts of solutions that the military needs to be looking at as we move forward. One of my former UK colleagues, I'm going to steal one of his examples, uses the example of the maritime environment, because it's not just about using the same equipment, it's also about thinking about how we can achieve the same operational effectiveness, but perhaps in a slightly different way. Now, the maritime environment, I know that the Royal Navy in the UK is now starting to look at uncrewed vessels, so drones, in order to sweep mines. Now, one, that reduces the risk to life if something goes wrong, because of course they're uncrewed, so no loss of life if it fails to do what it's supposed to do safely. Number two, there's a reduced cost, because of course a drone being detonated is not nearly the same cost as a traditional warship. And number three, we also reduce our environmental footprint, but we still achieve the same operational capability that we set out to achieve in the first place. All of that said, this is why NATO is having an enormous mainstreaming exercise in terms of looking at our procurement processes, looking at defence planning, everything that the Alliance does, where it's appropriate. We are looking at integrating climate change considerations within that security context to make sure that in the future we don't end up in a situation where helicopters can't fly and we can't deliver the mission that we have set out to deliver. That said, of course, we recognise that we do have a role to play in reducing where we can our emissions without compromising our operational effectiveness. And for that reason, we have also developed for the NATO enterprise a greenhouse gases emissions mapping methodology, which is based on the GHG protocol. So we've looked at international standards in order to deliver this. Again, all of this is encapsulated within another document which is flowing down through everything, and that's our climate change and security impact assessment, which I mentioned earlier. But we recognise that we can't do all of this on our own. And that's why the fourth pillar is particularly important, the outreach pillar, because, again, why would we not turn to our partner nations? Why would we not turn to other international organisations and get involved in the discussions that we're having here today, so that it's a two-way street in terms of learning from each other. I think in order to conclude for now and give somebody else an opportunity to speak, I'm going to touch on two personal perspectives, which I think is always interesting to do. When I started working on this 20 years ago, I used to get asked questions like, Richard, what are you talking about? Cardboard tanks? It's just like, no, I'm really not talking about cardboard tanks for all of the reasons that I've just outlined previously. Luckily, I don't get asked those questions anymore. And that is because the language of climate change and environmental security has come into the defence and security sector. However, the questions I do get asked, the one that my daughter asked me the other day, my teenage daughter, she said, so Daddy, what is it exactly you do in NATO? And I described a little bit about it, and she said, yeah, but doesn't conflict actually make the climate worse? And of course she has a point. And the reason I'm bringing this up is, although the language of climate change has come into the defence and security sector, what I don't think and it's not universal, but what we need to do is the other way around now. We need to get the language of defence and security into the discussion around climate change to really, really highlight that this one is going to bite hard unless we address it now. That's why I brought up the personal example, because I think it just goes to show you what people are really thinking about and what they're not thinking about. And it's up to us, using, I think, the 3 Ds fully, so defence, diplomacy and development, and really bringing them together. Because, of course, without the international rules-based order, there can be no sustainable development without that defence and security base. And actually the other way around. Because, of course, if there is no sustainable development, that has an impact on defence and security. So I think I shall leave it for there. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Richard, because we have, time is flying. You did mention a lot of points. I may come back to you to talk about mitigation and our own commitments to reduce our own emissions, but let's see, so stay tuned for that. But meanwhile, let's go to our second speaker, Sharon. Honorable Sharon Burke, who's Global Fellow at the Wilson Center, founder, president of Ecospherics, and also I have to say that when at this point a few years ago from my office, we were writing the first NATO climate change and security strategy. She was one of the experts that really helped us think through some of what became then the agreed strategy. So, Cheryl, let's go to you and talk a little bit about, you have extensive experience in supporting national militaries in going through their own climate transition and adaptation. So if you can give us a little bit of your thoughts in terms of where do you think we are, what's the state of play, what are some of the priorities ahead, what are some of the lessons learned, and then anything else you want to talk about.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yes.
I'd be very glad to. And I want to start just with 3 sort of precursor comments, and then a quick comment on NATO and on military activity in this space. You know, the first is that I am a technical advisor to the U.S. Department of Defense in their Energy Innovation Office, but I do not speak for the U.S. government. I am not in a position to do so, so I am not a representative of my government. Just a commentator, which is a really great position to be in. Secondly, I do very much appreciate that you're here, Benedetta and Richard, that you're here, because as you said, you know, there's a war going on that is the reason that this alliance was founded in the first place, and it's an increasingly dangerous conflict. And I know you have a ministerial today, so I think it speaks volumes about the commitment that the alliance has to this issue, that you are here at this important gathering to talk about this issue. So I'm grateful to both of you for the work that you've done and the fact that you're here to have this dialogue. And now, having said that, I think it is very important as someone who works with the U.S. Department of Defense and has spent most of my career in the defense sector, to be very clear that climate change and climate action are not fundamentally a military responsibility, and that what the military of any nation can do in this space is of necessity somewhat limited. And that in my own country, I do think we need to rebalance where we put our investment and our action on climate change, and that it should be more a question of innovation and economic development, that it's civilian agencies and civil society that need to lead. And I say that, I think it's been an interesting tension in that the United States, our Department of Defense carries a lot of weight in our polity in terms of the funding, in terms of public support, the relative size and strength of our defense organizations relative to our civilian organizations. So we have emphasized climate security and the defense role in it for some time, partly for all of those reasons, and also to reflect the political complexities within the United States on this issue, and that security is a place where we can have a bipartisan or a nonpartisan dialogue on climate change successfully throughout all of the turbulence that we have had of late in our political life. So, however, the same is not necessarily true of Europe, of European countries, of our allies, that it's not always been a conversation that's been deeply rooted in military organizations. So it's, NATO is playing a very important role on redefining what that looks like, what it can look like, what it should look like. I think then just a couple of other quick comments about that and what that actually looks like in practice. I would almost divide the legitimate role of armed forces, even though I think civil society and civilian agencies must play the lead, that doesn't mean I don't think that the military has a really important role to play, because climate change will affect their activities and they will affect it. So it's a great step forward to see this alliance taking it seriously and coming up with an action plan. And I would divide the activities into two different spaces. One on the sort of equipping and operating environment side. So as Richard said, some of your equipment will not operate in some of the new conditions. The operating environment is going to change and you have to adapt to that. Military bases and installations, a lot of them are on coasts and they're vulnerable. You cannot operate both your equipment, you cannot train your people. You cannot conduct operations, which many are remote now and are conducted from great distances, if your base is not secure and safe. So that is one bucket of responsibility. And it's almost, I wouldn't say it's comfortable for military organizations to push all their climate work there, because there's nothing comfortable about any of it and about the bill that it implies. But it's easier, right? That's a conversation that you can have, which is, our base is at risk, how do we make it more resilient? The other bucket or piece of activity that's much harder is, how is climate change going to shape our future missions? What does it mean for the security of our countries, and what will be the military role in that? That is a much harder space to define, and it gets into the core mission for militaries. Their core mission is to defend their countries, to fight wars when that becomes necessary, to prevent wars, which is always the preference. That's much harder to define, and also, like I said, it gets into core business, so there's a little more resistance there. You can see that reflected in the US investment. The Biden administration is making a historic commitment on climate security. The Department of Defense in fiscal year 2023 has announced $3 billion for climate security. Most of that is in the equipment and the installations and the resilience part of this equation. A little bit of it is in modeling and simulation, in wargaming and exercises. Most of the combatant commands, which are the main sort of doers in the US military, are all doing very important tabletop exercises now, which I'm happy to play a part in, because I think it's a really important driver for them. Those are the places where they're making the consequential decisions about what's the future look like, what does security mean in the future, how do we organize, how do we train, how do we equip for that future. Those are the significant choices and discussions and investments, right? So $3 billion is a great deal of money. Don't get me wrong, it's a huge deal of money. And the fact that it's going towards electric vehicles for military bases and that it's going towards hydrogen experimentation and microgrids could be consequential not just for the military, but for the civilian sector as these innovations transit. That's really important, it surely is. But the entire US military budget is, $700 billion to $1 trillion, depending on how you count. And the question is, how do we spend all of that so that it takes that future landscape into mind? And that won't happen unless we get into that bigger question. And we can come back on emissions, but I will just say one of the real dangers with getting too entranced with military emissions is that, for the U.S. Armed Services, it's a large organization. It has a lot of emissions, and they should be controlling it, and they are. They are working on that now to document and to manage their greenhouse gas emissions and to get into this operational energy question and lower the emissions. But there's two problems with that. First of all, it represents 1% to 2% of overall US emissions. So if you focus all your energy on cutting that, 99% of our economy is still where the action is. So again, you don't want to get distracted from what's priority. And then the other is, if you set up goals that are antithetical to the fundamental mission, your climate goals will get blown out. If NATO has to send forces to defend allies in Europe, they're not going to be able to curtail that action because of climate change goals they've set up that are not consistent with the core mission. So I do think that military organizations need to take emissions seriously and make investments in cutting them, but those goals will not succeed if you make them antithetical to the core mission. So.
Thank you, and maybe we'll develop this a little bit further because I think that's very interesting. How do we get somewhat beyond the false dichotomy sometimes that being more energy efficient or environmentally responsible necessarily affects operational effectiveness? I think in a world in which we are all going through an energy transition, either the militaries are in, or if they're left out, they will pay a really steep price. But maybe we'll return to that, just because the moderator is not supposed to put her comments in, but I just did, apologies. Well, actually, I think
I totally agree with you.
Thank you. You also led us into the next two speakers really, really well, because you mentioned, first of all, you started, and also Richard began to develop a little bit more what are the operational, strategic, tactical implications of climate change for our militaries. And I'm going to give the floor to our third speaker right now, who is Colonel Major Mahamadou Magaji of Niger, the director of the Centre National d'Études Stratégiques et de la Sécurité. And based on your extensive operational experience, I would really be interested in you adding to this conversation by going into how climate change is affecting armed forces missions now, and what do you think is happening towards the future? So you have the floor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I think it turns on magically when you start speaking.
Thank you
Yep.
for this opportunity to share my experience and insights on climate change impacts on armed forces and their mission. As one of the nation's main security providers, armed forces are concerned with climate change in many ways. I will first talk about the impact of climate change on armed forces readiness on operations. These are the direct impacts of climate change on armed forces. First, consequences of climate change like hot temperatures, sea level rise, floods, sandstorms, etc., degrade military capabilities. Indeed, military personnel, weapons, equipment, and infrastructure performance decrease when confronted with extreme weather events, which happen to become frequent because of climate change. For instance, mobility, maneuver, and force protection are impaired by these extreme weather events. Similarly, weapon range, and accuracy are negatively impacted by bad weather. So this is not new. If you recall, even in history, it's during good seasons that armies confront themselves during spring or autumn. It means here in Europe, during winter, you have less clashes. Second, since armed forces contribute to climate change by emitting greenhouse gases because of their high consumption of fossil fuels, they are increasingly requested to reduce their emissions as a contribution to national mitigation efforts. As a result, militaries in developed countries, some from NATO, are turning to renewable energies to function. So this improves their energy autonomy and their operations sustainability, with impact on force structure, organization, and operations. For these forces, lengthy supply chains, which are very risky, are no more necessary for their operations. Also, the introduction of weapons and equipment powered by renewable energy means developing new skills for military personnel, with impact on doctrine and training. Further, to be coherent and sustainable, these innovations must be taken into account in defense policies and strategies. Now, to the indirect impact of climate change on armed forces. With frequent extreme weather events, military are naturally and increasingly called upon to assist affected populations because of their deployment throughout the country, and most importantly, because they are equipped and trained to act in difficult circumstances. So one of the indirect impacts of climate change on armed forces is their growing role in humanitarian, disaster assistance and relief, in support to other government security bodies like civil defense organizations and the Ministry of Humanitarian Affairs. In my country, in Niger, military timely assistance was instrumental in saving many lives during the 2020 and 2021 massive floodings in the capital city. They intervened in support of civil defense and performed rescue operations and built temporary camps in safe areas, provided shelter and water to affected population. To prevent climate change effects leading to conflict, reinforcing population's resilience is key. And the military can support in terms of disaster preparedness, rehabilitation actions, as well as adaptation works. Further, in badly affected regions as the African Sahel, armed forces are expected to contribute more in adaptation actions. For instance, in places where surface water is no more available because of drought, military can support in digging water wells and drilling boreholes to provide water to people and their cattle, thereby avoiding climate migration that may lead to conflicts. So all this growing role for the military in terms of assistance is raising some fears, both within the military and outside the military. So these fears are in certain way legitimate, but when we look at the main goal of setting, but when we look at the main goal of having or setting up a military apparatus, these fears vanish, because the military is a public service set up for the good of the populations. And climate change is not only a national issue, but it's a global security risk. So my take on this situation is that to better address climate security issues, we have to get an integrated approach and to see what the military can do in this approach, how, to what extent. So all these fears, if the military is given a specified role and the means to perform it, I think there is no fear that climate change be militarized. Now, at the international level, what I can say is cooperation is needed. Cooperation is needed, share of experience and skills in terms of climate mitigation, climate adaptation. Some countries like NATO countries are well ahead in taking into account climate security. So this, their insight can be shared with other countries. And since climate security is a global risk, I think it's an opportunity, it's an avenue to cooperate even with adversaries, to share insights on climate security issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that was fantastic, because it brought together what both Sharon and Richard had mentioned, and I think it was very useful to look at the impact of climate change on our forces through the operational, strategic, tactical lens, and really seeing how this translates into dilemmas that go from strategy planning to the operational level, which I think it's also a really good segue into our last, but by no means least speaker, Luca Briganti from Airbus, works on sustainability research and technology as a portfolio manager. So I think this is a great addition to the discussion, because of course we're talking about equipment, we're talking about planning, we're talking about capabilities, and we would be remiss if we didn't have the defense industry on the panel to tell us a little bit about how do you see this discussion, how do you think the defense industry can contribute, how is the work on green technologies moving? Is it moving fast enough? And if not, or in addition to make it move even faster, what type of political signals would you wish to see from our national governments or from the alliance? So Luca, you have the floor. And just, our technical team tells us to keep the microphone close to your mouth.
Thank you. Doesn't work? Doesn't work.
Well,
it doesn't.
Keep talking.
Hello?
No.
Okay, so thank you, Benetta, for the question, and hello, everybody. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me here. For sure, the defense industry has a lot to contribute to. And we do it, of course, by providing the equipment that are needed to operationally enable the decisions and our customers. But in this particular case, we are key to develop the technologies, the sustainable technologies that can be used and can be implemented. And Airbus and the Airbus Defence and Space, which is our defense business unit, is a living example. We are focusing, and we consider sustainability such a key aspect of our strategy that we included it in our purpose, in our mission statement, which is pioneering sustainable aerospace for a safe and united world. Yeah? Our customer can count on our technologies in order to reduce their footprint, but in the same time, by no means reducing the operational effectiveness. As a matter of fact, we are successful in combining the two aspects, and we are even successful in adding some operational capabilities by implementing sustainability in the technology development. And I like to give a very pragmatic example. I'm an engineer, so I like to give examples. We have recently tested, as part of the cooperation with the Clean Sky 2 activity, which is a co-funded EU Horizon 2020 activity, co-funded by us with our R&T and R&D budget, together with the European Commission. We have demonstrated that our C295 tactical aircraft with a flight test bench can reduce the CO2 emissions by 43%, reduce NOx emissions by 70%, reduce noise emissions by 40%, while increasing, of course, reducing the drag and the consumption, which in turn can offer additional operational capabilities. Longer persistence, lower noise means also additional operativity and additional capabilities and features. Of course, we are very, very active with the sustainable aviation fuels or synthetic aviation fuel, so SAF. We are on the way to demonstrate the 100% compatibility of our fleet with SAF. This we do it together with our customers, but we have already started with an increasing, let's say, incremental stepwise approach. This year we have already demonstrated 30% to 29% capability to fly with our fleet. Next year we're coming to 50 and then to 100%. And those are concrete examples of how we can concretely implement sustainability technologies to enhance even the capabilities of our products, yeah, for the benefit of our customer. Implementing SAF means also increasing resilience. Yeah? Resilience was a topic. Yeah? We also go beyond the pure technology. We like to offer a so-called, let's say, a holistic approach to sustainability. That means we are in a very privileged position in Airbus that we can cover end-to-end needs. In particular, we start with what is, of course, the prevention. We have our fleet of satellites, of Earth observation and remote sensing satellites that are providing data for climate control and monitoring. We are controlling deforestation. We are checking the sea levels. We are monitoring the ice melting. But those data are combined, for example, with our connected intelligence. That means our secure communications technologies that are deployed throughout the world as well. Once we have, let's say, once the capabilities in terms of preventing have not been fully successful, then we certainly can support in protect what has happened. That means our aircrafts, our technology, and our products are there to support in the crisis areas, are there to support and to protect our people, is known. I mean, Eurofighter and A400M are a typical example of what can be done whenever there's a need to protect. And then again, in this very concrete examples, in terms of protecting, we have used in the past month, there has been a clear evidence of that when we deployed our A400M to evacuate people in the siege in Kabul. We have deployed our C295 tactical aircraft to relieve the emergency, the humanitarian emergency in Mozambique after the natural disaster in March last year. And then we move to the next step, which is restoring the capabilities and restoring the community. We are supporting that by doing that. As an example, again, the C295 that I mentioned earlier. So all these activities are there to support our customer in implementing their policies. And I really appreciated what Richard was saying before. We are certainly combining the operativity and the capabilities that we are continuing to offer and even enhance by implementing sustainable technologies in our products. And I think this is really the key in terms of having a win-win situation, a win-win opportunity to implement those technologies. Of course, we need now to work together with the legislation bodies, with the customers, of course, our MODs, and in the end, all our countries, our NATO countries, to support their needs. That's why we need to have a strong dialogue to define the environment. That could be, for example, very strong, and we are also in a very good position in Airbus and Airbus Defence and Space, where we are strongly cooperating internally with our Airbus commercial division, the operational commercial division, to make sure that we have synergies in order to ensure there is, for example, a clear example is there are discussions about implementing ASTM standards for the SAF compatibility, which is a civil standard, also for the military application. Those kind of synergies are the ones that are answering to your questions. And I think this we need to do it hand in hand with the customer. We need to do it with the governments. Of course, we need fundings, we need cooperations, we need a framework to work together. We can only do it together. Nobody can solve the whole picture alone, but we are there to support.
Fine. Thank you. I think and that's a really good way to also get us into the last part of our panel, because you brought up this notion that we have to work together as governments, private sector, involve the industry, nudge the innovation sector, and that's really essential, because otherwise we're going to not have the capabilities that we need when we need them. But I think you presented a best practice of how we can enhance operational effectiveness and sustainability, and that's really the win-win we're looking for. I'm looking at the floor here and see. We still have a little bit of time for Q&A. Of course, I have plenty of my own, but I rather open it up to the floor. And you were very quick, so perhaps you could ask your question. I'm sure a microphone will be forthcoming. Perhaps I shouldn't be sure. Meanwhile, Cheryl.
Yeah, I'll dance for a second while we get to you. Look, I just wanted to say a really interesting thing that's going to happen in the United States, according to the Deputy Secretary of Defense, is that they're going to start incorporating into their contracts and procurements the kinds of performance gains in aircraft that you're talking about. So it'll be a comparative advantage, a competitive advantage for your company. So.
That is an excellent point, and it leads us into our first question. Sir, please, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much for the insights and fruitful discussion. It's rather interesting topics. As NATO lately has been joined the Paris Agreement for net zero emission for 2050. And this is a question for Mr. Richard and even for Colonel Magaji. How reachable and achievable this target from one side to reach the net zero emission within 2050, and an example for the adaptation and the actual example from reality for mitigation and adaptation strategy that you already have from your experience. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. Just a second, Richard. I want to take, if there's more, I'm going to take two and then get back to the audience. I see the lady over there. And then we'll come back.
Thank you. A really interesting conversation. Thanks so much. My name is Emma Whitaker, and I'm a senior advisor at Adelphi. I just wanted to add to the conversation that a handful of NATO members have feminist foreign policies, and the list is actually growing. And feminist foreign policy, of course, recognizes that the effects of climate change action cannot be feasible without a scale down or, complete demilitarization. And even more have argued that, the reduction in military spending could, of course, be allocated to climate adaptation funding. So just wondering if you could sort of incorporate that into the discussion and talk a little bit about how, if at all, feminist foreign policy is informing NATO's work and your work. And if it's not, how it should or it could. Thanks.
I'll take the feminist foreign policy, but you do the first one. Sure. Richard, you have the floor. Please answer the first.
Okay, yeah, of course.
I'll take that one.
Thank you very much for the question. Of course, I should have mentioned the actual target when I spoke earlier. So the target that we have set ourselves in order to get to net zero by 2050. And I should highlight that this is for the NATO enterprise, because it is not, so this is essentially NATO-owned and managed assets and installations, because it is certainly not our business to tell allies how to do their business. So in order to get to the net zero by 2050, the interim target is 45% by 2030, and that is then backed up by, all the way to 2050, a year-on-year reduction of 4.2%. The difficult bit now comes when we need to work out technologically how we're going to deliver that. And in order to do it, there's a due process which all organisations can go through, and that's have a comprehensive energy audit conducted, essentially, where you're bringing in qualified engineers, where they can tell you where your inefficiencies lie, and indeed where some behavioural interventions can come in. And I think you also asked about real-life examples of win-wins, which could also help inform this. In previous roles, I've been involved in research where microgrids have been installed in off-grid military bases. Now, in this particular scenario, it delivered 80% of the building's power requirement. And this was in the heat of the middle of the day, in the environment that it was in, getting up to sort of 45 degrees centigrade, so obviously benefiting from that, and still delivering all of the air conditioning requirements despite that heat. A further intervention through this research that was discovered was, if you change the set point on the air conditioning from 22 degrees to 24 degrees, which is still actually quite comfortable if it's 45, 50 degrees outside, 50% energy saving. Now, and that's minimal technological intervention, that's more of a behavioural intervention. So I think all of these things really need to be looked at in order to get at our net zero by 2050. And of course, we need to do this hand in glove with industry in order to understand how to unravel that. And again, and this is more of an observation rather than a question, because I don't think this is answerable today. Because if we suddenly said, okay, and I know the Swedish, for example, have flown a Gripen fighter jet on 100% SAF, qualified by the equipment manufacturer. But if we were suddenly to say across the alliance, okay, 100% SAF in all our aircraft tomorrow, I wonder what the supply would answer to that. And of course, this is not something that we can just switch on and switch off. It's something that we need to map out.
Yeah. What I will do is to go in order very quickly, and if some, maybe Sharon, if you want to respond, otherwise I will continue.
Why don't you continue?
Yeah, fair enough. Colin,
just one quick comment on that. If you went to 100% alternative fuel tomorrow, I would have questions about where the deforestation impact is in order to supply that. So there's still some innovation that needs to go on, I think, in order for those kinds of shifts. Yeah, and to be clear, the United States as a military, as a partner in NATO, shares the net zero goal and also has some more ambitious goals in certain places. The US Army, for example, is committed to clean electricity on their bases. They're the largest by numbers of our services by 2030. And that's as a purchaser of power. They have tools, with financial tools that they can use to accomplish that. So I think to answer that question, I think if you start from now and you look forward and you say, is that a feasible, reasonable goal? Are we going to be able to do that? You will find a million reasons to say, no, it's not. So I think it's really important to start the other way around and say that is the goal that you have to achieve because there is no other option. So now figure out the pathway to get there from here.
I think that's a great point. I'm going on this side of we are on our closing moments, but we will get to the second question as well if anybody is adventurous enough to reply. Otherwise, I will.
I can make a quick additional comment to that. The vast majority of the US national budget goes to social programs, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and then a big chunk to the debt service. The national defense budget, when you take it, on its own, looks huge, but compared to everything else that my government spends money on, it's not that much. And I think that no one would be happier to demilitarize than the people in uniform that go and fight wars. But the question is, what you don't always get to choose. So I think that has to be a balanced answer to that, which is how do we be prepared for everything and balance those choices and make sure that we are investing enough in our non-military forms of governance so that we can build peace, not just fight wars.
Yeah.
What I just want to add is greenhouse gas reduction targets are not mandatory for low-emitting countries. Only if a country wants to volunteer to get a target. For instance, sub-Saharan African countries have a 3% share of the total emissions. So due to that, the agreement, Paris Agreement, consider that it's a very low emission, and it's not mandatory for them to have a target. So same for the net zero emissions for the armed forces. But they still need to have a share of experience and insight from developing countries' armed forces like NATO to share what they know so far on the efforts to reduce greenhouse. Thank you.
Would you care to?
I just wanted to, Richard, ask a question that I wanted to briefly answer. We are up to the challenge. The real issue today is the availability of SAF. On our side, we are ready. As I said, we are doing it on our R&D and R&T budget to demonstrate our capabilities, even not always, and a lot of times we do it ahead of our customer. We do it together with the customer, but we need requirements, and we are ready. Yeah? The real bottleneck today is the availability of SAF, and again, maybe answering shortly to that, there are other ways to get SAF. Yeah? We can gather it synthetic. It doesn't have to affect some other. Yeah. The scale up is the real problem. Yeah. So.
Thank you. And we have very few seconds, so of course, that doesn't give enough time to give a good answer, but maybe just let me attempt. First of all, there's a lot to say in terms of how NATO as an alliance has integrated its a women, peace, and security-centered agenda based on principles of inclusivity, integration, and integrity into everything we do. And I see the sign blinking, so I will not go more into it, but I'm happy to tell you about it. But then I want to just take 30 seconds to respond to the second point, and I really absolutely agree with what Sharon has said. Of course, the ultimate objective, and that's why you have a military alliance, military and political alliance like NATO, is to prevent conflict. That is what we're there to do. We might have a debate of what's the best way to prevent conflict. I would argue that the relative peace dividend that many of us, especially as Western Europeans, have enjoyed over the last few decades has been guaranteed, actually, by the fact that we had a strong deterrence and defense posture. And I would say if you look what is happening in Ukraine at the moment, unfortunately, I think we have to be realistic. You have a country waging, Russia, that being, of course, waging a brutal and unprovoked all-out war in the middle of Europe, and we're seeing the gravest security crisis in generations, and we're seeing atrocities, war crimes, we're seeing all that. And so we need to be very careful about how we think about our security and defense. And of course, the goal is to prevent war, but the notion that we prevent better war by not being prepared and by not investing in defense, I think, unfortunately, that's not the world we live in. I wish it was, but it's not. And with that, I think we can close with a note of optimism. We can close the session, and thank you so much. Please join me in thanking the panelists for really bringing a very insightful conversation.